everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of Bluecoat's Live and Ask a Scientist. We're working together with Science North and the Ontario Science Centre today to do an amazing live, and we're talking all about the weather, nature, and everything that's happening outside for spring. So I have a very special guest who's joining me today from the Ontario Science Centre. I have Laura Murray. And Laura, hi Laura, how are you?
Hi. I'm great. How are you doing, Amy?
We're really good. So Laura and I are here today to answer all kinds of questions that you might have all about spring and the things that you're seeing in your backyard, down your street, in a park, wherever you might be, about things that are happening in nature all around you right now. So to give you a little bit of an idea of who we are, I am a marine biologist, so I love everything that lives in the water, the oceans, our lakes and rivers. And one of my favorite things to talk about is the weather. So I expect a lot of cool weather questions to come through. What about you, Laura? What do you love?
Well, I studied wildlife biology and ecology at the University of Guelph, and that kind of covers a lot of ground. It's all about the interactions between animals and plants and insects and their habitats and their environments. So that's the kind of stuff I love talking about.
Excellent. And you love nature, right?
I gotta say, I love nature. Nature's a good thing.
We've got a really good couple of nature nuts on with you guys today. So what's really exciting for us, because we're live today, you can actually put in some questions for us below in the comments. They're going to pop up to us, and hopefully we can answer some of them and get into some of the really cool stuff that you're seeing in your backyard. Now, we started this conversation the other day because both me and Laura were sort of wondering, wow, spring is here. The snow has melted, although in Northern Ontario, there's still a bit of snow still left in the forest. And we were kind of laughing at me, though, just a little bit, because I got so excited about spring being here that I decided, great, I'm going to get my garden all set and ready to go. And I decided to plant my tomato plants early, way too early, because I kind of forgot that the warm weather for growing plants here in Northern Ontario doesn't show up for many, many more weeks. So unfortunately for me, I have very large tomato plants at my house right now that can't go outside. So I'm going to have to find another little home for them. How's the weather at your place, Laura?
Well, it's kind of a cool, blustery kind of day. I always think of spring as being a whole variety of things, and that's kind of normal for there to be variations. I know someone asked a question about it can be warm and then it can be cool. That is kind of spring. And that's sort of what we're getting today, even though we had a warm day yesterday. But someone also asked a really good question about why do we have spring? I mean, and so maybe we can start with that. And I've got a globe here. It's a little globe. But basically we have spring because of the tilt of the earth in comparison to the sun. I know this is a tiny globe. But if you can see this red line going around here, that's the equator. But you can see that it's not lying flat like that. It's tilted. It's on an angle. And so the earth is actually about 23 degrees tilted. And so when it spins and we go around the sun once a year, different parts of the earth actually get different amounts of direct sunlight. And it's those differing amounts of sunlight and warmth that mean we have 4 seasons in the year, which frankly is the way I like it. I like all the seasons. So, that's why we have such variations in our temperatures. And, so we're just starting to get into spring now. I've actually turned the globe. This is Canada up here, if you can see it, up there. Hard to see, close to the North Pole, which would be right at the top. But that's the basis for why we have seasons in the first place.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, it's true. I love the 4 seasons too. And I don't know if I'd be able to live somewhere that didn't have spring, summer, winter, fall, all the different variations that happen. That's for sure. So that was a really great question. That question came from Dezo, who's 6 years old. So thank you so much for that question. That was a really, really good one. So I thought maybe I'd ask the next question that we got was just from Maria, and she's 9 years old. And so she asked us, so how come is it warm one day and then cold the next day? Which is kind of weird because that's what we've been feeling here in Sudbury. And I know that's what you have been experiencing in and around Toronto as well. So yesterday was really warm. Today's a little cooler, a little rainy here. And then coming into the next week, it's going to get much warmer. So why do we have that kind of variation? Well, it all has to do with different air masses that sit on top of our planet. So we have several types of air masses that affect us here in Ontario. The first one is an obvious one, which is the Arctic air mass. So that's the one that comes from the north and sweeps down towards us here in Ontario. And that's what brings really cold weather. So when we're in the middle of winter and it's really, really, really cold outside, it's usually because we have an Arctic air mass that's coming from the north to the south. But where we are located, we also have an influence of a southern warm air mass that can come up from the United States. And it actually comes all the way up from around Florida, around the Gulf of Mexico. And it will come up and bring warm air with it. And so sometimes we get that warm air mass coming up, and sometimes we get cold air masses coming down. And depending on where those air masses sit will basically be how our weather feels today. But we live in a really cool place in Ontario where we also have weather that's influenced by all kinds of stuff around us, including the Great Lakes. So when I'm sure many of us have experienced those heavy winter snowfalls that we get, the lake effect snow, and that all has to do with the amount of water and the Great Lakes that sit around Ontario. So we get other influences as well that change our weather on the day to day. So that's a really good question.
It's the same here in Southern Ontario. Because Toronto is right on the shore of Lake Ontario, we also have those influences, and that can be a moderating influence so that we have actually a milder climate and weather close to the lake. But on a day like today in spring, when the lakes are cold and the wind is whipping from the east, it's a very cool day in Toronto. So that also contributes to such a variety that we get from day to day. So that is a great question.
That is a good question. Oh, this one I love because I know that I feel a little sniffly at this time of year. Do you have allergies, Laura?
I don't, and I'm very thankful for that because I love being outside.
You're so lucky. You're so lucky. Oh my goodness. So Caitlin, who's 7 years old, she asked us, why do I get allergies during the spring? Oh, I hear you, Caitlin. And many people get allergies in the spring because plants are actually producing something that's really, really, really important for them, which is called pollen. And that pollen helps to make new trees and new flowers and helps to build things like fruit on fruit trees. And they often get spread into the air. And that pollen is so, so small that you can breathe it in. When you breathe it in, though, your body doesn't necessarily know what it is. And for some people, their body reacts in a way that it wants to protect itself. And so when it wants to protect itself, it'll do things like make your nose runny, make your eyes runny to try to get rid of that pollen that's come into your system, the foreign thing that's come inside, to make sure that your body kind of sheds it and gets rid of it, which is one of the reasons why you get allergies. Laura, why don't you give us a little explanation about some of the trees near you that will start having pollen in the air right now?
Yeah, and it feeds into that question about allergies because right now most of the trees are starting to flower. So we tend to think of flowers as being, the big showy things like sunflowers or tulips or that kind of thing. But trees are some of the first things to flower in the spring, and the flowers are so small and kind of not noticeable. And that's in part because showy flowers tend to attract pollinators, the bees, the birds, the bats, that kind of thing. And the flower helps to draw them in with scent and with nectar and that kind of thing. Trees often are relying just on the wind to pollinate. So on a windy day like today, I know there's a lot of pollen flying around in the air. And one of the trees that I have out front is a silver maple. And I collected a few little twigs here. They're not that easy to see.
Oh, wow.
But those are silver maple flowers. These actually are the smaller ones. The bigger ones are still in the trees. The squirrels haven't kind of nipped those off yet, so they were out of reach. But I can, if I look out the window now, I can see lots of trees starting to get little flowers showing up. They're not the leaves yet. The pollen gets circulated before the leaves come out so that it can spread around more easily. But they're just starting to show that sort of fuzz. What's happening up your way, Amy?
Well, here's a coincidence. I also have a silver maple in my backyard. And so my silver maple, I was like amazed by yours because your flowers are so big. So I took a branch off of mine, and you see how tiny my flower is? It's so small compared to yours. So we're generally up in Northern Ontario. We tend to find that our growing season is a little bit later than yours. It starts a little bit later, and that all has to do with the type of weather we have versus the type of weather that you have. We just got rid of our snow a few weeks ago, but you've had no snow for a very long time.
Yeah, I would say it's been a mild winter, even though it's been a cool spring. And I would say we're definitely running behind temperature, and it's also quite dry. We haven't had much rain at all. And, everyone may have heard that saying, April showers bring May flowers. We're still kind of waiting for that really rainy weather to kickstart thing. And I know there's been a lot of questions about how do plants get these cues. There's a question here from Charlotte, age 5, saying, how do flowers know it's time to poke out of the ground in spring? And there's a lot of things that plants react to, and animals as well. One is the amount of daylight. So that doesn't change with the climate or the weather. That's consistent from year to year. But the temperatures that we get can vary. So the actual temperature, as well as the temperature in the soil, that's a cue for plants to start to grow a little bit. So a cooler spring means we'll be a little bit delayed. And so those are all the things that plants and animals also cue into. And we also had a question about how do birds know that it's time to go back? And it's interesting with birds because they rely on the amount of daylight, something called photoperiods. So you may have noticed, since Christmas time, the days are getting longer and longer and longer. That's the photoperiod. So more daylight. So birds often cue into that, but they also are paying attention to their surroundings. So birds that are spending the winter to the south, it could be things like warblers or sparrows or Canada geese. They need to find food wherever they are. So if it's a late spring, they'll probably be a bit delayed in arrival. And especially for some birds that rely exclusively on insects, the insectivores, things like swallows, or warblers, with a cool spring, there are fewer insects around, which are also cueing into those warmer soil temperatures, because a lot of insects are actually snoozing out the winter under the layer of leaves. And so the warming soil helps to bring them out. It's one of the reasons why you should leave your leaves down for quite a while, because lots of beneficial insects are actually hanging out in that leaf litter over the winter. And if we disturb it too soon, then they don't get a chance to do their job, which is a loss for the habitat overall. So animals tend to put together a lot of different cues, but they want to be timed well so that they can arrive when there's a good food source available for them.
That's neat. I never thought of not raking my lawn up. I always leave the leaves over the winter and then rake them in the spring, but then I never thought about leaving them so that the bugs can, come out and live and provide that important food source too, right? For other animals. That's a really good point. Thanks for that, Laura. That's fantastic.
Yeah, and it's,
Bluecoats learned something today.
Well, we all can learn something. That's the great thing. It's also, again, I mentioned things like sunflowers, which are big, showy flowers, but a lot of nature is on a very small scale. So really looking very closely at the tiny things is where you might be surprised at what you can see that's going on there. Things like insects just awakening in that leaf litter. They're just starting to get going now. They're not the big fuzzy bumblebees so much, but I've seen little tiny bees that are out and about, starting to visit the earliest flowers, things like the dandelions, which are coming out now, which are actually a good and important source for the early pollinators.
I saw my first caterpillar of the year the other day, and I thought to myself, wow, that caterpillar is pretty brave, because it's still pretty cool up here. but so we'll hope that he makes it.
Yeah, I actually had a first butterfly on the weekend, a mourning cloak, which is known as one of the earliest butterflies to come out. And we tend to think of butterflies visiting flowers, which of course they do, but this is where the trees and those early flowering trees and the bits of pollen that are nectar that are there help the early butterflies, like this mourning cloak. So that was a sure sign of spring to me.
Nice. So we also had another question, and it kind of goes back a few months, because now that all the animals and insects and things that are coming out in the spring, Alicia asked us, how do the animals in the water survive in the winter? Oh, sorry, that was from Harper. So how do the animals in the winter survive? Like, so when they're sitting in water, like how do they live, right? Well, my favorite story about one of these types of animals, and I'll tell you, it is a funny one, is all about turtles that live in our water. So turtles don't actually hibernate, but they do go into, and they'll start burrowing in mud underneath the water, and they'll slow down their bodies. And one of the problems with turtles, though, is that turtles are air breathers, just like you and I, right? So they use their nostrils, they use their mouths to breathe, just like you and I do. So a turtle can be under the water, then it comes up and gets a breath of air, and then it goes back down. But how can it stay in the water all year long, right? Well, turtles have a very, very special adaptation to that. And they do something really weird, where they actually, yes, Laura knows.
I know.
They actually breathe through their bums, which is crazy, right? When you think about it, but they'll bring in water into their bums, and they'll use the oxygen that's in the water already. So the same oxygen that like a fish or something else like that might use. And they'll use that to keep their bodies going all winter until it's time to come out. And I think that's kind of one of the neatest adaptations. And many water animals do that. They hibernate in the mud. They'll burrow down. They'll shut all of their major body functions, kind of slow down their heart rates, making sure they're not using a lot of energy, and then find some other way to get the oxygen that they need in order to survive for the winter. But there are still many, many animals that are actually active all winter long. And somebody asked a question about beavers, and beavers are by far my favorite Canadian animal. I love beavers. And beavers are awake all year long, which is neat. They don't hibernate. And if you're walking on a lake in the middle of the wintertime, you could actually be walking on type of ice where a beaver is swimming underneath. That could actually happen. And beavers stay in their lodges all winter long. And in the fall, what you'll see beavers building a huge cache storage of food for themselves. So be piles and piles of sticks outside of their lodge that they'll use to grab and get food in the wintertime. So it's very, very neat in the fall to see what they're doing. But one of our friends asked us all about beavers and why do beavers build dams in the springtime? And that's really interesting. So beavers build a dam to make a habitat for themselves. So when they build a dam, that dam holds back a lot of water, and it creates a nice deep pond for that beaver to be in and for that beaver to live in and around. It helps them make sure that there's enough water for their lodge so that they can go under the ice in the winter. And during the winter time, their dam can sometimes get damaged, especially as ice is hitting it and frozen against it. So in the spring, they get really, really busy and start making sure that they're solidifying that dam back up again. So that is really, really important for them. So when they have their young, which they have just around the sort of mid to late winter, that they're young, they're babies, and them can have a great summer with really nice deep water and a perfect habitat where they have access to their food, they've got their lodge as their shelter, and they've got their pond all set and ready to go.
Yeah, I love beavers. And what's really amazing about beavers is they're actually animal architects. They really they create the habitat they need to live in, as you've said. And you know, we probably all heard the phrase "busy as a beaver," and they are very industrious. I've been out and about in a couple of local parks and have seen lots of fresh evidence of the beavers at work. You know, they're waking up, they're repairing their dams because, you know, the water level is higher with a bit of snow melt and that kind of thing. So probably they've sprung a leak in a few places. So they're patching that up with mud. They've probably already given birth to their kits that'll be inside the lodge. So they're looking for sources of fresh food, but they're one of my favorite animals too. So I love that they really are an active part of the environment and do so much to create habitat for all kinds of other animals. Beaver meadows and beaver ponds are super important habitats, and in fact, wetlands are one of my favorite habitats. And I love going to wetlands in the spring, where sort of where land and water come together. There's so much going on there. It's really great to see them coming alive in the springtime.
Absolutely. And wetlands are also really great stopping grounds and for a lot of birds that come to us just for the summer and then fly out for the winter. So what kind of birds are you seeing in and around your area that maybe it's in a wetland or a forest that, you know, are just starting to arrive, but maybe weren't here in the wintertime?
Yeah, well, I'm a bird watcher, so you know, I love to see the changes of the season, and you know, seeing the first red-winged blackbirds in kind of the middle of March. You hear them; they're very loud. They're such beautiful birds, and they're living in wetlands. So they've been here now for probably about 6 weeks. I think I saw one quite early this year. Um, Canada geese, of course, are starting to return to ponds. Some of them do overwinter here. If there's enough open water in an area, lots of birds can overwinter, but some do migrate as well. So they're definitely on the move right now. And just starting to see some of those insect-eating birds, the swallows. And I saw my first warbler yesterday, a yellow rump warbler, just out in my backyard, which is they're always early, but that was great. And what again, just this week, I've started to see white-throated sparrows, and these are small sparrows that mostly hang around on the ground, and they're kind of kicking through the leaf litter. So we talked about those insects that are snoozing under those blankets of leaves. That's exactly the type of thing that white-throated sparrows are looking for. And they start to come through, and they're very jaunty little sparrows. And I'm going to try to do the bird call for you here. So I'm going to move closer to the microphone a little bit, see if this works. Okay, and maybe just listen quietly because it could be quite quiet. I'll start again. So I don't know how well you could hear that, but there's bird watchers often sort of pair words to the sound that a bird makes. It's not so much that the birds are saying those words, but it's kind of the rhythm and the pattern of their call. So in the case of the white-throated sparrow, I'm going to try it once more. That pattern, the way they've transcribed those words is, oh, sweet Canada, Canada, Canada. So it's kind of a way to remember that when you hear that pattern of notes. And I love that one because it's very Canadian. And the white-throated sparrows have been spending mostly the winter in the U.S., where you know the conditions aren't as harsh, and they're moving up into Ontario, throughout most of Ontario now. So they're something to watch for and listen for, and I love hearing their calls, and they're becoming very active. The other thing that I noticed is American goldfinches, which are pretty small little finches, so kind of related to cardinals and other sparrows. And in the wintertime, the males are quite a dull yellow, and they've just started getting their breeding plumage, as it's called, their breeding feathers. They're bright yellow, like little lemons, with black markings. And so that's a sure sign that breeding is underway as they start to move in. And that's just happened in the last, I'd say about 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago, when I saw goldfinches, they were still in their winter dress, if you will, and now they're switching over to their bright yellow coloring, which is amazing to see.
I've seen the goldfinches around our house too, who have been coming to my feeder, and they're very, very dull colored in the winter. And now all of a sudden, yeah, you can see the males. They're just brightening. They're just starting to brighten up right now. And
yeah,
and you think almost that it could be an entirely different bird.
Yeah.
And there are lots of birds like that, right? That have different coloring in winter and summer.
Yeah, I mean, things, especially birds, probably closer up to your neck of the woods, like that are overwintering, things like grouse or even ptarmigan, which are further north, much further north in Ontario and into the Arctic. They turn, quite white in the winter time, and then are changing to a, better camouflage for the summer. In the same way that snowshoe hares do that. And other animals as well. So that's an adaptation to survival. If you can be better camouflaged in whatever season, then that's always going to be an advantage. So for sure that's happening in some cases, definitely.
That's great. I'm just going to remind everybody that we do have just a few more minutes left. So if you do have a question, make sure you get it into the chat below, and so that we can answer it. And if we don't get time to answer all the questions today, we'll be sure to get back to you, make sure that we get the answer to your question and to you so that you can learn a little bit more about spring. This one goes back to when we were talking about beavers, and we have Tanya who's wondering, how many kits do beavers usually have? And so they don't have lots of kits, but they don't have very few either. So they can have anywhere between 3 to 6 or 7 kits at the most. And so they'll have those in the winter time in their lodge, and then the kits will grow up all season with their parents that year. So that's a really good question.
Now, Amy, were you looking after some beavers yesterday at Science North? Because Science North is beavers, right? You were doing a little care of them.
We do. So we have one beaver. His name is Kashkunashku, and we call him Cash for short. And he is now 4 years old, and he is quite an amazing critter, that's for sure. So he's definitely feeling, I would say, a little uneasy about why there are not very many people around the Science Center at the moment, but he's getting really good care from all the Bluecoats. And I know we've been letting him hang outside, cut down some of the trees on the property, and he's got a favorite tree that he's been working on. Even though it's already cut down, he has to go back to it all the time to make sure the job is finished. So it's quite funny. He's a wonderful animal ambassador that we have at the Science Center. So and just a really neat animal to learn from and explore and learn more about. That's for sure.
Yeah, well, I guess he's a truly social animal. So now he's probably suffering a bit with not having all his people around so much.
Yeah, we give him a lot of extra attention from the Bluecoats. That's for sure.
That's pretty fun. I see there's a question here from Ian, who's 7. Wondering about how do hibernating animals know that it's spring in time to wake up. And we talked about beavers, which are kind of active a lot of the year, some of the other cues that birds use, but for the animals that live here, and lots of birds stay here over the winter, woodpeckers, cardinals, that kind of thing. And I'm thinking particularly about frogs, which are, again, one of my favorite animals, frogs and toads. And some of them are really, truly amazing. You have wood frogs here in Ontario, which are pretty small little guys wearing a little black mask. They're very stylish, I think. And they're one of the first frogs to wake up in the spring. And they don't need very much encouragement at all, just a little bit of warmth. But what's amazing is they can actually freeze over the winter. They have a built-in antifreeze in their bodies. In the form of an alcohol. So they do this in the fall where they can convert their system so that it's really flushed with antifreeze. In effect, not the same kind of antifreeze you put in the car, but similar idea. So they can safely overwinter. And then they're one of the earliest ones to wake up. And I love hearing the sounds of frog calls. That's another sure sign of spring to me. And out behind the Ontario Science Centre in Toronto, we have quite a big wetland. And you can sometimes hear the American toads out there. And they have a very high pitched trill. I could try that one. I don't know how well that's going to work, but something to listen for down in the city. But up where you are, Amy, things like the spring peep, the wood frogs and the leopard frogs, they're all going to be starting to get going, especially the peepers. Anyway, I'll give the American toad call a bit of a tryout. It's just a high pitched trill. So it's really just a fast paced trill. And if you hear that, you might think it's a bird, like a woodpecker or something. So, you know, it's amazing. These tiny little frogs and toads can make such an incredible sound. And that definitely is one of the sure signs of spring for me. Now, Amy, are there things you're really looking forward to with, you know, a change in the weather and the advancement of spring?
I think I'm most looking forward to getting out and going hiking in some of the amazing trails that we have up here, because going hiking and exploring the outdoors and really getting into nature itself is always fun and exciting. And some of the things around me right now are, some of them are closed, which is a little sad, but we're going to wait for things to reopen and then be able to go and explore. My favorite place is just north of my house, about a 10-minute drive, and it's called High Falls in Onaping. And it is a beautiful, beautiful waterfall, and it's my favorite place to visit because not only is it just a beautiful sight in the springtime with all the spring water coming through, but it's also full of really, really interesting wildlife and trees, and I've seen a few porcupines around there as well. So it's one of my favorite places to visit.
That sounds amazing. Yeah, that's. I think we're all feeling the need to get out in nature. I think at such a strange time in history right now, nature to me is a great thing to invest time in, and you know, take a chance to really look at what's happening. For me, I'm really looking forward to getting out in a canoe and sort of paddling across a lake, just, you know, taking it in and hoping to see some common loons. You know, all of these things that are really a signal of the changing seasons and the changing weather. So, you know, hopefully we can do that soon. We're getting to the end now, but I think we got a couple more questions. I see there's a question here from Stephen McIntyre, who's wondering about flooding in Sudbury and or Guelph, and what can we expect this season. Now, this is not my area of expertise, but my feeling is in Southern Ontario we had a pretty mild winter with not a lot of snow. So I think the spring melt will not be as dramatic, but typically the Great Lakes are still running at a higher than normal water level, as far as I know. What's the situation up where you are, Amy?
Well, it's certainly not as bad this year as it was last year. Last year, we had record amounts of snowfall. We had more snow than I have ever experienced since I moved to Sudbury about 15 years ago. So it was a lot of snow that melted fairly fast with a lot of rain. And because of all those ingredients coming together, we had a lot of flooding. This year, we had sort of average snowfall. It was a good amount of snow, not too little, not too much. So sort of average. And we've had a nice sort of just general coolish, you know, introduction to spring. So it hasn't melted too quickly. And we haven't seen any significant rain amounts until today, because there is a rainfall warning today.
Okay.
But we're still waiting too, because of where we're located. We're still waiting for a lot of the snow to still melt in the forest that's located to the north of us, that will come down our rivers. So we're still waiting for that snow melt. I certainly don't expect us to have the same type of flooding situation that we did last year, which was quite dramatic.
Yeah, I guess it's all about moderation. You know, if you get a heavy snowfall that melts very quickly with a lot of rain, you get a lot of water coming into the watersheds, and that can overwhelm them. Yeah. But if it's more gradual, then the earth has a chance to soak it up, and that's where places like wetlands are so important, because they act as a natural sponge to help moderate some of those effects of flooding. And so that's one of the things I love about them. There was a question here I saw. I'm just going to answer this question from Miguel, which was when is it safe to tidy the garden so that the bugs are not disturbed? I think typically they say when the daytime temperatures are kind of 10 degrees Celsius or above. That gives the insects a chance to develop and move on. And we're not there yet. This is, we've had a couple of warm days, but consistently we're running, I think, a couple of degrees below normal. And it looks like that may continue for a little bit of a while. And then there was a question here from Mia and Olivia, age 5. And what plants can we plant for birds and butterflies? And every butterfly and caterpillar, like you saw a caterpillar, have what are called host plants. So they depend on certain plants. Sometimes it's a wide variety of plants. Sometimes it's very specific. And many of you may be familiar with the story of the monarch butterfly that only relies on one plant. Just the milkweed plant, that's the only one they can live on. And that's why they're in trouble. They're an endangered insect. And so it depends on what sort of butterflies may be living in your area and what plants they need. There isn't kind of one answer to that question. So it's certainly something you can investigate further if you want to do your bit for the pollinators, which is a great thing to do for sure.
Absolutely. So we have another question here, which is about bird feeders. So they have, we have some Mia and Olivia are going to be making some bird feeders at home, and they're wondering what kind of like seed should they be putting in their feeders?
Yeah, it's often people have bird feeders out over the winter. That's what I do. I take them in around this time. And I usually just stick to black oil sunflower seed. It's very universal for most birds. There isn't a lot of waste or a lot of mess. You can get more particular, but I would say that's a really good, just simple thing to do. Things like woodpeckers, they need a more concentrated source of energy. So that's where you can get suet, or you can make little suet feeders if you want, or use things like peanut butters with rolled oats and seeds mixed in for some of the woodpeckers or nuthatches or other birds. In part, it depends on what birds are in your area, what you want to attract. There's been a lot of discussion amongst the birding community about when the Baltimore Orioles are going to arrive, or the Northern Orioles. And one was spotted in London, Ontario just yesterday. And people put out halves of oranges for them. The Baltimore Orioles love these oranges and also grape jelly, apparently. I've never done it, but I do have Orioles in my neighborhood, so maybe I'll give that a try. So, birds have different needs. And, the birds that we see at bird feeders, it's great to watch them. And there's lots of ways to get involved with citizen science if you want to do more for birds and watching them. But there's a lot of birds that never come to feeders. So there's a lot of other birds out there that are also looking for their food. And that's where we talked about things like the leaf litter, or, robins. You may see them hopping along the grass after rain, because the worms tend to come out at that time. And the robins are very smart birds, I'd say. Sometimes I think I put on the sprinkler in the summer, and the robins hear the water going and they come looking for the worms. I think they're pretty smart. They're pretty smart birds. So, there's a whole variety out there, and it's kind of amazing to learn more about it.
That's really neat. We just got a question in. I'd love to hear whether you know more about this, because it's from your neck of the woods. So Laura was asking, and Gavin was asking, they saw a female wild turkey in Port Credit a few days ago. And is that normal or unusual for that area, or?
Well, this is another thing that's getting attention in the birding world. Ontario, several decades ago now, wild turkeys were really in decline. And so the government actually started a program to breed them and reintroduce them. And it's been wildly successful. So there are wild turkeys all over Southern Ontario. We're seeing them all the time. In fact, one was seen at Toronto at the Leslie Street Spit on the weekend, which is a first sighting for that area. So they're in the city of Toronto. You're starting to see them more. They're big birds. They're often in large groups, so they're pretty hard to miss if they're around. they're going to be taking advantage of things like leftover food and seed in farmers' fields. They don't move very fast. They're pretty big, so they're definitely around and about, and so they're spreading out into new areas. So I would say port credit. Yeah, I'm not surprised at that at all. They're really finding their way back, which is pretty neat.
That's really neat. Oh my goodness. So I wanted to go, but just to quickly back to bird feeders, because in Northern Ontario, I kind of forgot to mention this. In Northern Ontario, it's really, really important to be careful about bird feeders in the springtime. And the reason for that is that you could end up with maybe some larger animal friends that you may not want in your yard. And I'm really thinking about black bears. So as black bears come out of hibernation, of course, they're looking for really quick, easy sources of food because they are hungry. And bird feeders are a perfect example of that. So while I have a bird feeder out in my yard all winter long, and I also use the black sunflower seeds as well, I can't keep it there in the springtime. Otherwise, I will have bear visitors. So it's really, really important that if you do live in an area where you do have black bears that may be roaming around, just to be careful about what kind of bird feeders you're putting in your yard in the spring.
So and that's a really good point. I mean, we don't have black bears in the city of Toronto, but things like raccoons and other animals, if you want to be careful about who you're feeding and who you're not feeding, the raccoons, I like them. They're very cute. They're very what are called opportunistic. They've really taken to city life. They're really urban animals now. But we've got lots of raccoons. I don't know that we need to encourage feeding them anymore. So yeah, you want to be sure that the food you're providing is getting to the animals, that it's intended for. Just while I think about it, in terms of feeding animals, one of the things that has become a bit of a common practice is to feed things like bread to ducks and geese. That actually can be very harmful to them. It's not a natural food for them. It has very little nutritional value for them. And often people may do it with, say, moldy bread or stale bread, which can even be more damaging to the animals. So it's really best not to feed them at all. I know we love looking at them, and it's great to get close to nature and really have a good look at these animals, but feeding birds and ducks things like bread is really not healthy, and it can actually damage the environment around as it leads to more polluted water. So something just to be mindful for as we're all getting a little bit more out in nature.
Absolutely. So we all love to go out and we all love to enjoy what's around us, but just to be a little bit careful about how we interact with wildlife as well, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Our last question before we wrap up today is from Jordan, and I think it's really topical. So Jordan asks us, how does COVID-19 affect nature? And this is kind of one of these questions that we're still asking ourselves. We're still learning so much about the COVID-19 virus that we don't know whether there are types of animals that can have it, that can carry it. We're still learning a lot about this virus. But one of the cool things that I think is happening is because we're all right now in our homes, not necessarily going to work or school, our environment around us is a lot quieter. There's not as much traffic, there's not as much noise. And in some parts of larger cities and communities, we're starting to see wildlife more often come into those areas that we may not have been able to see them before. So things like, moose wandering through streets because they're nice and quiet now. Birds coming in that may not have taken up place in parks because they're nice and quiet. Have you seen anything or heard of anything unusual on your end, Laura?
I wouldn't say that I've seen anything unusual. I spend a lot of time in the city parks, and Toronto, we're very lucky because we have a lot of ravines that are, really a legacy of glaciation. So thank you, glaciers, for all the ravines in Toronto. So I'm pretty familiar with it. I think part of what's happening is more people are in parks that they didn't normally go to, and they are actually seeing things that were maybe there all the time, but they weren't encountering them because they weren't there. So it's sort of an interesting phenomena. I think it may be sort of two halves of the same coin in a way. you know, I think your point about traffic is a good one. So probably there's a lot less traffic, which is going to be better for the animals. And so, you know, right now, which is such a key time for animals to be raising their young and that kind of thing, probably more of those animals are going to survive to breed themselves, to reproduce and have young, because they're not interacting in negative ways with humans as much. So, you know, hopefully it'll be interesting to see what happens maybe in the next months or even the year ahead if we see a sort of increase in general population of different wildlife because they've had a bit more breathing space maybe to do what they need to do without interference from things like traffic. But it's hard to say what's going to happen. I think you know, hopefully one of the good things that comes out of this is that people are engaging with nature more now that they have time. They don't have the same time pressures, or they have more access maybe to things, whether it's just looking out the window or going, you know, safely to a local park or something, to really start to notice those things, which is always good, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and that's what I think Laura and I both encourage you all to do is it's a great time to go out and exploring, go for a walk in your neighborhood, take a look up in a tree and start to notice the things of spring that maybe you never had a chance to notice before, and really get involved in seeing what wildlife is around you in your backyard and what nature is basically doing around you. So we're going to wrap this up today. Thank you so much, Laura Murray from the Ontario.
Thank you. This has been so fun.
This has been great. So what a great partnership. 2 science centers in Ontario having a really great discussion about nature and what's around us. So we would love to hear from more of our viewers all about the things that you're seeing in nature. So if you want to put in some comments below about maybe the types of things you're seeing and where you're located, we would love to hear more about it. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, and any questions we didn't get to, we're going to try to keep answering those. There were lots of great questions. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and yeah, stay safe and enjoy nature wherever it is, on your doorstep or in your backyard.
Wonderful. Thanks, Laura. We appreciate it. We'll see you soon.
Yep. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone. Thanks for tuning in.
Bye.
Bye.